Hunger Ward is a harrowing and beautiful documentary that's been nominated for Best Documentary Short at this year's Oscars. I'm Tony Ruiz of Gold Derby, and I'm here with the film's director, Skye Fitzgerald. And Skye, as I was preparing for this, I came across a term that you used in an interview about the concept of humanitarian cinema. And I wonder if you could just explain that concept, because it's such a wonderful idea.
Yeah, that's something that during the course of this trilogy that Hunger Ward is the last film in, I sort of, I don't know if I coined it, but I don't remember ever hearing it before. It's the term that sort of represents what we're trying to do in Hunger Ward, right? And it's this idea that basically cinema can be a force for good, right? Cinema can be something that transports us, that brings us to a place maybe we wouldn't be able to go otherwise. But not only that it can also be something more than that it can actually, it can help us care more deeply and more fully and generate empathy in the watching of the film, so that by the time we get to the end, we want to engage with the content of the film, which is one of the beauties of what nonfiction can do, right? So that's the underlying principle of the film, actually.
And we were talking beforehand about how the whole situation in Yemen is such a media black hole, for it seems like, and partly by design, also just from an American perspective, it's just not something that the average American hears that much about. So how did this situation really come about for you?
In terms of the making of the film?
Yeah.
Yeah, so it was sort of a confluence of different factors that came together just at the right time. I'd already finished the previous film, Lifeboat, and that was a study of sort of the trials that asylum seekers face trying to cross Central Mediterranean. And so anytime I do a film, I always make a sort of an abiding effort to stay in contact with people we filmed with, and to sort of track the narrative of what happens after we leave the filming as well. And so what happened in that instance is that the flow of asylum seekers was shut down across the Central Mediterranean. The EU basically just cracked down with Frontex and prevented asylum seekers from making that transit. And what happened was that then that flow of asylum seekers sort of shifted eastwards across the Red Sea. This huge flow of asylum seekers and economic migrants started going across the Red Sea to the west coast of Yemen, and then up the west coast of Yemen to the border with Saudi Arabia. And so I was studying this at the same time that I had already been looking at the scale of displacement in Yemen of IDPs, internally displaced people, which was so horrific. And right when I was sort of learning what was unfolding in the country, I had a couple colleagues who had been able to get into the country, come back and sort of share their personal stories of what they'd seen firsthand. And that was the clincher for me, because I knew that our own government was complicit in the war, and that we were paying for the bombs that were dropping in the country. We were selling the bombs, rather, and that we were active partners in the blockade over the country, which was contributing to the famine. So at that point, it was a matter of how could I not do this film?
Yeah, and the two kind of central figures at the center of this film are the doctor and the nurse, working in basically this, I think, what do they call it, like a nutrition, like where these starving children are pretty much
TFCs.
Yes.
Yeah.
So how did you get in contact with them?
Yeah.
Yes, therapeutic feeding centers. Yes. How did you get in contact with these two, and how did you build that relationship of trust that allowed you this kind of access?
So I made contact through colleagues. So colleagues who had been able to access the country despite the media blackout that sort of the coalition has tried to enforce on journalists and filmmakers getting access. And so once I was able to make contact with my colleagues who had actually successfully entered the country and done stories, they put me in contact with both Makia and Dr. Al-Sadiq. And we started a conversation. And it was a robust, long-term conversation, frankly, where I sort of shared our intent with the project to try to understand what it was like as a healthcare worker in this conflict zone, where day in and day out they face this fundamental task of simply trying to save a child. And once we shared our intent, interestingly, both the healthcare workers, Makia and Aida, they really were quite enthusiastic about collaborating, because they felt like it was only with a greater sort of Western demographic knowing about what they were facing and about the US's complicity in the conflict could the geopolitics shift and change so that the famine could end. Because that's the thing about this famine that's happening in Yemen. It's human caused, right? It's not caused by locusts. It's not caused by drought. It's caused because there's a war in the country, but there's a blockade, both sea and air, over the country that's preventing people, supplies, and resources from getting in and out. And that's just a horrifying fact that we in the West ought to know about. And we hope that the film can be a vehicle for that.
There are so many moments, as a parent, I'm watching this, and you can't help but become really emotionally invested in it. How did you navigate, because there are these just terrible scenes of these children in despair and sometimes dying. How do you even begin to tackle that as a filmmaker, earning the trust of not just the doctors, but the people who are experiencing this?
Well, I mean, you nailed it with the word trust, because that's just a foundational principle of being able to do work like this. But trust, there's a lot of pieces to trust, right? I don't see it as this sort of all-encompassing static entity, right? I think you have to behave consistently with those you're collaborating with. You have to have an incredible amount of compassion for witnessing and bearing witness to. And you have to communicate on a really regular level in terms of consent. Are they okay with this? Are they not okay with this? And, of course, one of the things we did from the outset was sit down with each of the families and, just like we did with the physicians, share what we were trying to do. And then there were a good number of families which wanted to collaborate, and there were a handful who didn't. And so, we made sure that we didn't do any filming with them. But, it's not static, right? It's something that is dynamic, especially when a child is sort of on the cusp of death through starvation. So it was a dynamic environment where we had to be willing to pivot on a moment-to-moment basis. And when a really hard moment happened, we had to some extent share in that grief. We had to find a way to really empathize and be there as a mother experiences the grief of a loss of a child. And speaking for me personally, I have a 10-year-old child here in the States, who weighs 95 pounds or so. And seeing Omema, who's 10 years old, also in the film, who weighed 24 pounds when she was weighed, for me, I was constantly doing that comparison in my head, right? And thinking about my own child and how I would feel if he was in such a dire state of health. So I think it's a matter of just being there in the moment, really, in many, many senses of the word.
Yeah, and that's a conversation I've had with a lot of documentary filmmakers about this idea of almost the empathy becoming part of the story. Is that something that you're always conscious of as a filmmaker, of your emotions connected to the story?
That's a great question. Yes and no. You know, as a director, I'm always thinking about story and narrative, right? But as a human being, as a dad, I'm also I'm sharing in the compassion of the moment. So it's not one or the other. I think they're sort of woven together. And in this particular story, one of the things that I thought about as these events unfolded, where there were so many children really at risk of death, I began thinking about how in the West that we're not very good with our own mortality. That I think it's something that we're less willing to look straight on at than many other cultures. And I felt like because of that, it became even more important to sort of do a direct look at death and grief and loss, just like the grandmothers and the moms and the doctors were doing in the culture of this hospital and this clinic. And it's why, you know, we don't cut away often, even though it's a really hard moment. It's why there aren't edits on some of the longer shots where something is unfolding. And even if it's a very difficult personal moment, I think you experience it differently if you don't allow the viewer to look away by doing an edit. So I allowed sort of that idea to inform both the shooting of the film, but the editing of the film in terms of longer because
Yeah, there was a certain, almost like a Frederick Wiseman sort of, because I'm a big Wiseman fan, so there seemed to be.
I'll take that. Go ahead. Sorry.
No, but I mean, was that who when? It's always interesting, you know. You talk to directors sometimes about who their influences are, and I'm wondering, in the realm of documentary, do you have different influences, or are you influenced by some of the same filmmakers as in, you know, traditional narrative filmmaking?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question. I would say I'm influenced by a lot of filmmakers because there's so many fantastic, great filmmakers to look up to in both fiction and nonfiction world, obviously. But I'm constantly influenced by the work of others, as I think we ought to be as artists, right? So, you know, I can think of a handful of films just off the top of my head that I think are just brilliant, that I think probably did inform how I approach this story. Even I think of a film called Taste of Cement. That's a featured doc that was done in Lebanon a couple years ago, right? That covers Syrian refugees building a skyscraper. It's a brilliant visual observation of this displaced community that is just classically really beautifully done, right? I can think of Immortal, which was an hour-long doc that I think was on the circuit last year, done in Northwest Russia, I think, right? That is a view of, you know, this industrial Northwestern Russian town that really speaks to how, you know, how citizens are built in Russia, right? Through propaganda and other means. It's brilliant. So I'm always looking for those influences, and I'm consistently inspired by them.
So you talked about how.
And Philip, sorry, I need to. And Philip Noyce, if you're out there listening, Rabbit Proof Fence is probably will always be one of my influences, as well as Satsi by Gavin Hood. So if you two are out there somewhere, I love those two films.
I'm sure they're right here listening right now. So you talked about how this film kind of came out of your previous film, Lifeboat. So has this film kind of opened up something that you want to explore in your next film?
Another great question. I think what it's brought up for me is, you know, I set out to do this trilogy, and you know, you never know when you set out to do a film where it's going to lead you. And one by one, now I've been able to create each of the three films, and I feel I'm very proud of that. And gratified that I was able to complete the trilogy. And I am not sure where that leads me next. It hasn't organically yet sent me to the next project, although I have full confidence it will. So the answer is no, I don't have any idea what my next project is, but I'm in the hunt.
Are you specifically drawn to certain subjects? Like, you know, the last two films, especially in the trilogy, are been, you know, very, very, you know, tough, harrowing films. You know, could potentially something lighthearted be in your future?
My wife always asks if I'm going to do a film about puppy dogs or dandelions or lollipops or, you know, something light and fuzzy that would be a little lighter fare. And, you know, to be honest, Tony, I just don't think I'm built that way. I just, I'm called to do certain types of films, frankly. And is that the wisest choice in the world? Probably not, because human rights docs, you know, they're notorious for being difficult things to fund it and also do and create, and then also to find distribution. So it's a challenging task, but to me, I feel like sometimes the challenging tasks are the most important ones. I will say though, I guess there is something on my bucket list that I haven't done that I would like to do, and that's I'd love to do a music doc. I've never done that, and I don't mean a concert film, but something like Miss Americana, you know, which I find so revealing and wonderful and heartfelt, frankly, where I learned something about Taylor Swift. I didn't even know who Taylor Swift really was. I just knew she was a singer when I watched that. And then I had some communications with Lana Wilson, the director, and watched it. And I was really moved, and I learned so much at the same time. I became a fan, you know? And I think it showed us the creative process in a really beautiful and moving way. And I'd like to try my hand at that at some point, which is probably counterintuitive given my previous track record, but I'd love to give it a shot.
And I think we'd all be here for it. So, Skye, it's just the trilogy as a whole is just wonderful, and I hope everybody gets a chance to see these films. Everybody go to goldderby.com, make your predictions for the Oscars, and stay tuned for more contender interviews throughout the season. Skye Fitzgerald, congratulations, and best of luck at the Oscars. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Tony. Appreciate it.